Good evening, I'm Judy Woodruff. On the NewsHour tonight, a wave of massive protests in Hong Kong sparks debate over the future of the territory and its relationship with mainland China. Then Amy Walter and Tamara Keith analyze the latest campaign moves by the Democratic presidential hopefuls and what to expect from the formal launch of President Trump's re-election bid. Plus, pedestrian deaths in the U.S. are at a nearly 30-year high. What to do, especially in western cities that were not designed for walking, with wide roads and few crosswalks.
For a mom who's trying to get to work every morning and drop off her kid with a stroller, how is that mom supposed to be able to cut across the street and use that sidewalk when there is not an accessible way for her to do so?
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. Iran is warning that it will exceed its uranium stockpile limit under the 2015 nuclear accord in the next 10 days. The country's Atomic Energy Agency also says that it will step up uranium enrichment to near weapons-grade levels. Today's announcement is aimed at putting more pressure on European countries to compensate Iran for U.S. sanctions.
We are suspending, we are not revoking the commitments, we are not removing the commitments. Of course, urge them to quickly do whatever they want to do in order to compensate the situation and, of course, to bring back once again the balance between the commitments and, of course, the obligations.
The White House National Security Council called Iran's announcement, quote, nuclear blackmail. The U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal more than a year ago. Egypt's former president, Mohamed Morsi, died today after collapsing in court. State prosecutors said the 67-year-old spoke briefly and then fainted. The Muslim Brotherhood leader won Egypt's first free elections in 2012 after pro-democracy protests. He was ousted in a military coup the next year and has been jailed ever since. His family said that Morsi's health crumbled in harsh prison conditions. The now banned Muslim Brotherhood accused the state of murder. Lights are back on in Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay after an all-day blackout on Sunday affected millions of people. Streets in Buenos Aires stayed dark into the night, and businesses lit candles in Uruguay's capital, Montevideo. The outage also disrupted transportation, communications, and water supplies. There is still no word on the cause. In Mexico, the foreign minister announced today that the newly formed National Guard will fully deploy along the border with Guatemala this week. Mexico pledged to deploy 6,000 troops to stem the surge of Central American migrants after President Trump threatened tariffs. The founder of Chinese tech giant Huawei conceded today that U.S. sanctions are taking a major toll on revenues. He estimated the company will take in $30 billion less than initially expected over the next 2 years. Huawei's overseas cell phone sales are also expected to drop by 40%.
We did not, in our initial assessment, expect it to be this serious. We had made our preparations, just like an old airplane. We had only protected our heart and our fuel tank. We did not protect the other necessary components. So in the next 2 years, the company will suffer a setback.
The U.S. has banned most American companies' transactions with Huawei over fears that it will help Beijing spy on other nations. In Toronto, shooting broke out during a victory parade today for the NBA champion Toronto Raptors. The gunfire briefly touched off a panic at the back of an estimated crowd of 2 million. Ceremonies stopped for a moment and then resumed. 2 people were wounded and 2 people arrested. The U.S. Supreme Court today threw out a judgment against an Oregon bakery that refused to make a wedding cake for a same-sex couple. But the court sidestepped issuing a major decision. Instead, it ordered state judges to review the case again. Separately, the justices upheld trying defendants for the same crime in state and federal courts. It is an exception to the double jeopardy rule with implications for the Russia investigation. That is, anyone pardoned by President Trump on federal charges could still face state charges. The Vatican has formally opened debate on allowing married men to be ordained as priests in remote parts of the Amazon. The proposal came in a working document for a meeting of South American bishops. It would mark a historic shift to address the region's clergy shortage. The document also called for more indigenous women in church leadership roles. On Wall Street today, stocks managed modest gains. The Dow Jones Industrial Average was up almost 23 points to close at 26,112. The Nasdaq rose 48 points, and the S&P 500 added 2. And heiress and designer Gloria Vanderbilt died today in New York of stomach cancer. She was the great-great-granddaughter of railroad and shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt and the mother of Anderson Cooper, the CNN anchor who announced her death today. Vanderbilt gained fashion icon status with her line of designer jeans in the 1970s. She was also a talented painter and collegeist and acted on stage and on television. Gloria Vanderbilt was 95 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour, the rising tension between Hong Kong and mainland China. What we know about the U.S. military's ability to hack into foreign computer systems. Amy Walter and Tamara Keith update the race for the 2020 Democratic nomination, and much more. Hong Kong is in the middle of the most significant protest since a 2014 pro-democracy movement known as the Umbrella Revolution. This weekend, protesters gained a substantial win when the city's chief executive suspended controversial legislation that would allow for the extradition of suspected criminals to mainland China. But on Sunday, they said that wasn't enough, and 2 million filled the streets to demand the permanent withdrawal of the legislation and the resignation of Chief Executive Carrie Lam. The demonstrators were out again today and say they are taking on not only the legislation, but also the Beijing government that is behind it. We begin our coverage with Matt Fry of Independent Television News, who's in Hong Kong.
If the Umbrella Revolution had a recognizable figurehead, it is this young man who was released from jail this morning. Joshua Wong was only 17 when the protest started 5 years ago. He spent a month in prison for contempt of court, but as soon as he got out this morning, his contempt of the leadership was undimmed.
And let the whole world, let the international communities to realize that how Hong Kong people will not keep silence under the suppression of President Xi and the Chief Executive Carrie Lam. Carrie Lam must step down.
So only hours after his release and a quick change of shirt from white to black, Joshua Wong was back, doubling down on message and microphones. In the crowd, Rocky, an accountant, felt inspired.
Yes, he just got back like 5 hours ago, and he just came down here with us and doing our things to protect Hong Kong.
If the government here thought the protests were exhausted, they were wrong, once again. The millions of yesterday may have gone back to work, but the thousands who keep up the pressure now know they can count on the rest to come out if necessary. People power on demand, summoned by WhatsApp.
The whole world is watching!
It is indeed. The whole world is watching, and China is recording it too. These cameras are mounted on the Chinese Army headquarters. What happens here matters because Hong Kong is the canary in China's gold mine. And China may well dominate this century like America dominated the last.
Do you think in the end you will change China or will China change you?
I think we are building an international alliance to fight against the new type of authoritarian rule of China. We are not alone. A bigger enemy is coming. So don't look.
What's the bigger enemy?
The bigger enemy is the Communist Party in China trying to bridge capitalism with authoritarian rule and do it with the latest AI technology.
That report from Matt Fry of Independent Television News. So what is motivating the demonstrators in Hong Kong? And what do the actions of Hong Kong's chief administrator say about Beijing's motivations? Nick Schifrin has more.
Judy, for months, Hong Kong residents have been demonstrating in large numbers against that extradition law. But the estimated 2 million demonstrators for Sunday's march was unprecedented in recent memory. To talk about that, I'm joined by Lee Chuk-yan, a former member of the Legislative Council of Hong Kong and co-founder of the Labour Party. Thank you very much for coming on the NewsHour. Give us a sense, how momentous are these demonstrations?
This time is 2 million people march. It all surprised everyone when the people are so angry. We believe that the whole march is a turning point for Hong Kong. Our freedom space is being squeezed, and now we are coming back. And so this march, 1 million, and in a week time, 2 million is record-breaking, and it really shows that the people of Hong Kong are determined to fight the bill.
Why do you say that people feel that their freedom is being squeezed, and why has this issue especially made people so angry?
Most of us do not trust the judicial system in China. And the stories about the China human rights defender, spending 4 years in jail without going on trial. What if this China judicial system that are trumping out charges, that are famous for torture, are going to, get their claw into Hong Kong and grab people out back to China to be on trial? So the people are really afraid. We thought we have a firewall, but now it's all broke. They want to break it and grab people out back to China. What happens if some foreigner is in Hong Kong? They can grab any foreign investor back to China, and that would be also end of Hong Kong as a vibrant economic city, international city. So all the economic, political, everything together, and people want to fight back.
Hong Kong's chief executive, Carrie Lam, says she will postpone the extradition bill indefinitely. Is that good enough?
That's not good enough. We want the total withdrawal, firstly, because postponing, people will read it as a delaying tactics, and then she can revive it. It's no longer just about the bill. It's also about the arrogance of Carrie Lam not listening to the people, a kind of violence, police violence, that we are really scared of the people, and we are very angry that police are suppressing the people of Hong Kong.
Chief Executive Lam argues that the law would not be used to prosecute anyone based on their race, religion, nationality, or, to your point, political opinion. Does that reassure you at all?
Yeah, China said that they don't have any political prisoner. Does that reassure you? We are not talking about Hong Kong judicial system. We are talking about Beijing political judicial system. In Hong Kong, the court cannot protect us. So it only takes a witness statement in China. You cannot, in Hong Kong court, sort of cross-examine the witness. So, Hong Kong court cannot do anything. And China judicial system can do and good at trumping up charges.
What do you think this weekend says about how Beijing considers and sees these protests, and how might they respond in the future?
We have come out. We have won to a certain extent. And international recognition and lots of government condemn Carrie Lam, and behind her, of course, Beijing. So Beijing loses faith. What I'm worried now is maybe we have a advance in the democracy movement, in the people movement, but then they will remember. They will step up in monitoring all the opposition figures in Hong Kong. And so, and also in the future, they will do something to sort of suppress the opposition. So they will take the revenge, and that's what worries me. But we are good at fighting back. So I hope that we be still okay in the future.
Lee Chuk-yan joining us via Skype from Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And to talk more about the end of that interview, Hong Kong's future, and Beijing's possible actions, we turn to Doug Paul, a distinguished fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and former senior director for Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff and member of the State Department's policy planning staff. Welcome back to the NewsHour. Thanks very much. Hong Kong demonstrators have achieved a bit of a short-term win right now, but what about medium-term, longer-term? Do you expect tensions between these demonstrators and the government in Hong Kong to increase?
I hope they don't increase in the short term. We've just bypassed a real tragedy in Hong Kong, and the retreat of the government in the face of this overwhelming political support for the opposition was a wise thing to do. Beijing's long-term desire to control and to homogenize Hong Kong into the rest of China, however, is not going to be given up easily. It's temporarily not expedient for China to have a bloodbath on the streets of Hong Kong, or even less than that, a real crackdown. But it would be in the long-term interest to continue the pressure and salami slicing tactics they've used over the last years.
To try and increase their control.
Increase control and reduce the amount of dissent that comes within Chinese body politic from Hong Kong.
So let's talk about the effect of Hong Kong on the Chinese politic. How embarrassing is this for Xi Jinping, the president of China, and are officials trying to pretend that they had nothing to do with it?
Well, as Mr. Lee was just saying in your segment, he has lost face as a leader. Xi did not put his own personal stamp on all of this, but nobody believes this would have gone forward without his at least tacit approval. And now that he's had to yield a little bit, people will say this is an opportunity to take him down a peg, to show that he doesn't have the universal wisdom and knowledge of the situation that he pretends to have. But this is not going to be a short term. The Chinese think long term, and especially the Communist Party. So
talk about as you put it, the universal wisdom that Xi is perceived to have as president of China. There is a sense in this country that Xi Jinping is kind of all powerful. Does he have opponents, and will they use this against him?
It doesn't take much of a visit to China to encounter, within and without a government, widespread unhappiness with Xi Jinping's rule. And it really was accentuated when he extended his tenure to be lifelong tenure without limitation a year plus ago. So there's a lot of latent opposition. Manifest opposition is tough in China because Xi controls the public security and propaganda apparatuses. But people are really looking for opportunities to trip him up. Sometimes the best opportunities are when he himself makes a mistake, and then people exploit that to say he's not quite the leader we thought he was.
And so this will be seen as a mistake. And how will the people who are opposed to him use that, given the fear that so many people have in China of the surveillance state and Xi Jinping himself?
It's always complicated because these are shadow games. Some of them will want Xi to make more mistakes, to push, for example, the U.S. trade war too far, to go too far in putting pressure on China's neighbors on territorial claims, because that might bring him to a downfall. Others might want him to moderate and make some more room for their own voices in the Chinese system. A whole class of people who are like Xi Jinping were there to help him when he first came to power, but he's now been shoving them aside, and they would like back in at the table. And I think they will have their own various means of trying to do that.
You mentioned the trade war today here in Washington. There is discussion for another round of possible tariffs. The trade war goes on. What is the impact of something like Hong Kong on U.S.-China relations and on the trade talks?
Well, it's a multi-level game right now. Xi Jinping is trying to strengthen his hand going into meeting with Donald Trump, if there is a formal meeting in Japan at the end of June, by visiting with Putin twice in Central Asia and St. Petersburg. And now he's scheduled to visit later this week to North Korea. He wants to be the player that comes with lots of allies and lots of cards to put on the table before he meets with Trump. And at the same time, if he goes too far, he may alienate the U.S. and put China into a more difficult economic vice, as the trade tariffs are magnified by a large extent in the aftermath of a failed meeting. So he's kind of got to find a balancing point. It's been summarized in party official documents just this past weekend, where they say, on the one hand, we're not afraid to fight. I go to Korea, fight the Americans in the Korean War. On the other hand, we're not afraid to bargain and to make the necessary compromises. So he's trying to strike a balanced position, and all of these elements come into it. Hong Kong blowing up would not have been helpful for his purposes in these circumstances.
Absolutely. Doug Paul, Distinguished Fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Over the weekend, the New York Times reported on American military efforts to infiltrate the electric power grid of Russia, a largely civilian target. As John Yang tells us, it's a flashpoint in an emerging digital conflict.
Judy, the Times reported that the president and Congress have given the Pentagon's Cyber Command, which is based at Fort Meade in Maryland, the authority to conduct offensive operations without direct presidential approval. That means commanders there can operate more freely and, in theory, more nimbly. The intrusions into Russia's electrical grid are the latest reported example of U.S. military efforts on an increasingly crowded digital battlefield. For more on this, we're joined by R.P. Eddy. He's a former National Security Council official and the founder of Ergo, an intelligence consulting firm. Mr. Eddy, thank you very much for joining us. Can you give us some understanding or help us understand the scope of U.S. offensive cyber operation?
Well, U.S. Cyber Command, which is the part of the U.S. government, part of the Department of Defense that's intended to undertake our offensive defensive cyber operations, is 10 years old actually this month, and it's a massive undertaking, meaning that this reporting to me isn't shockingly newsworthy because we've been working diligently, spending billions of dollars to understand the vulnerability of our adversaries around the globe for a decade at this point, at least. And before Cyber Command, of course, we were doing this in other guises.
And how important is Cyber Command to U.S. military power?
Think about how disruptive the use of cyber attacks against Facebook and other aspects of our cyber domain were in the 2016 elections. The way the world's turning right now, we live in an extraordinary connected world. We don't quite understand what would happen if the power went off, but if you spend some time thinking about no water, no hospitals, no ambulance, no traffic lights, what that all means, it means people dying. That's a cyber offensive capacity. The critical infrastructure of most nations is controlled by things connected to the internet or to computers. That's a cyber target or vulnerability. So I'd say the capacity to create deterrence in the cyber domain is extremely important for the United States right now as we try to push deterrence around the globe.
Is there a concern or is there a danger that what we view as deterrence, one side views as deterrence, the other side could see as provocation?
Yeah, I like the way you put that. So one of the concerns about this entire domain is that it's still considered a secret, right? So all of our cyber offensive or other nations' cyber offensive capacities, if they even exist, are considered a covert capacity, meaning we're not sitting down in the public and talking about them. While nuclear weapons and normal missiles and other things are horrible weapons of war, we have treaties around them. We understand what is a proportional response, what is not. We've not had those conversations when it comes to offensive cyber activity. So the capacity of one nation to misunderstand another, for one nation to think that a cyber intrusion or a cyber attack means one thing to them, it means something much more aggressive or offensive, could happen. So there could be a real room for miscommunication here.
And so in other words, it sounds like there are no sort of rules of the road here. It's a little bit like the Wild West.
The Wild West is a really good analogy. There are no rules of the road. And remember, we're now talking about taking attacks against non-combatants. So there are obviously rules of warfare about hitting non-combatants, but in the world of the cyber war, people may not consider that to be a violation of the International Criminal Court or other legal statutes that we have to follow inside the rules of warfare. So if I shut down the power grid in New York City, that will lead to the death of people that are non-combatants, and that is an offensive operation against non-combatants. And we haven't had those conversations. So it is the Wild West. There's not enough conversation on this. The norms haven't been established. I would just say quickly again, look back at how puzzled we all were about the manipulation of Facebook and other social media during the last election. The technology is far outpacing the diplomacy and the conversations around these issues.
And giving the authority to the Secretary of Defense, to the head of Cyber Command, to carry these things out without direct presidential approval, without direct presidential authority, is this a sign? Is this military commanders now calling it an airstrike? It's now just another weapon in the arsenal?
It is another weapon in the arsenal, and it's one that we haven't had real conversations about, as we mentioned before. To activate potential implants or to take advantage of cyber vulnerabilities would be an offensive operation of war that is not delegated right now down to individual commanders. So I would be shocked if the head of Cyber Command believes right now he's allowed to press a button and deploy cyber weapons. I don't think that's where we are.
And this all started, or at least the people first may have become aware of Stuxnet when the National Security Agency launched this malware against the Iranian nuclear program, which got out and was now being used by others, or had been used by others. Is this now moving into the Pentagon? Is this sort of another step, another sort of Pandora's box being kicked open?
So it's not entirely clear yet who was behind Stuxnet, and all the reporting that the United States was on it is sort of non-verified reporting. But whoever did release Stuxnet put a very, very powerful cyber weapon out into the wild, and criminals in other nation states have since taken that weapon and repurposed it for their own use. So much like a drone being shot down in a hostile country, American high-tech drone being shot down and being reprogrammed by the hostile nation, such can some of these cyber weapons be repurposed by people we'd rather not have them, cyber criminals or adversary nations. That's another thing we have to make sure we're really thinking about when we catalog the unintended consequences of different cyber activities, cyber warfare activities.
R.P. Eddy, a former National Security Council official. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, what can be done to stop the rise of pedestrian deaths in the U.S.? How an actress came to terms with her husband being caught possessing child pornography and turned her struggle into a play. And 50 years after the start of the gay rights movement, memories of the Stonewall Uprising. But first, the demands of working class voters are front and center on the Democratic campaign trail. As Yamiche Alcindor reports, most of the candidates are tackling a critical question: how to help America's poor.
And I found it hard. Poverty, race, and inequality. Today at a candidate forum in Washington, D.C., those were the topics of focus.
We have to raise the minimum wage to a minimum of $15 an hour. It's disgraceful that someone works 40 hours a week and lives in poverty.
If you vote for me for president, by definition, that means you're ready for me to say we're going to have reparations for slavery, not just because of the economic force, but because of the spiritual and moral force that comes from the recognition that damage has been done, a wrong has been done, a debt is owed, and it shall now be paid.
Across the country over the weekend, Democratic candidates joined fast food workers striking for higher wages. From Senator Kamala Harris in Las Vegas.
And we have got to recognize that working people deserve livable wages.
To former Texas Congressman Beto O'Rourke in Charleston, South Carolina.
You all ready to march?
Yeah! At a church in Spartanburg, South Carolina, O'Rourke later talked voting rights.
The heart of our campaign is bringing everyone in, making sure that over the coming years we register tens of millions of our fellow Americans through automatic and same-day voter registration, that we remove obstacles like voter ID laws that keep people out of the ballot box.
Also in South Carolina this weekend, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, and South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg. At a forum for Black civic and business leaders, they spoke about closing the wealth gap between Black and white Americans.
No one who works in this country ought to be poor. It's that simple.
2 cents on the dollar on the fortunes above $50 million is enough to produce the kind of investment in America that would help to close the black-white wealth gap.
Senator Cory Booker showcased his plan to benefit people of color.
The average black family, black child, under this program would get close to $30,000. The average white child about $15,000. It would virtually eliminate the racial wealth gap, giving everybody a fair start in creating wealth in this economy.
Candidates will soon have another chance to make their case to the crucial early voting state. Later this week, nearly all of the 23 Democratic contenders plan to head to South Carolina's Democratic Convention. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Yamiche Alcindor.
And now it's time for Politics Monday. I'm here with Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report and host of Public Radio's Politics with Amy Walter podcast and The Takeaway from WNYC. And in Orlando, Florida, gearing up for President Trump's rally tomorrow, Tamara Keith of NPR. She also co-hosts the NPR Politics podcast. And hello to both of you. So, Tam, since you are in Orlando, let's talk about what the president is expected to do tomorrow. What are you expecting, and why Orlando? Why Florida?
Well, already they have the roads shut down around the arena where this rally is going to take place. It's going to be sort of a big classic Trump rally, like the ones that he held toward the end of his campaign, where he filled arenas all over the country. And there will be tailgating because Trump rallies are in some ways like going to see the Grateful Dead. You get to hear the songs you want to hear, and he always plays the greatest hits, if you will. So why Florida? I came down here a day early to do some reporting. I went to the Villages, which is this area that is this very fast-growing community outside of Orlando. Lots of political reporters visit the Villages. About more than 100,000 people live there, and they're all senior citizens pretty much, and most of them are Trump supporters. The Republican population is strong there, and they're high turnout voters. And what is here in the Orlando, the Villages is going to send 5 busloads of people to that rally. What is here is it's a state that President Trump needs to win if he wants to get another term. And they use these rallies to organize people, to register people to vote, to get names and numbers so they can follow up later.
So, Amy, we've known, I mean, it's not a surprise the president's running for re-election. I think he announced it on the day he was inaugurated. But does a day like tomorrow make a difference?
Yeah, well, I think it does for the president's supporters, give them something to rally around. And the focus has been so much on the Democrats and their opposition to the president that he now gets a chance to sort of reset the argument, make it about the case that he's going to make. But it is really notable that, Joe Biden kicked off his campaign in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, a state that Democrats have to win if they're going to win the Electoral College. Tam's right. If Trump is going to win re-election, he has to win Florida. And it is fascinating when you look at that central corridor where the president's kicking us off, the so-called I-4 corridor between the Orlando and Tampa area. It is the fastest growing, not just in the state, but in the country, the Village is. These are folks who are coming in from places where Trump is really popular, like Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. So think about where the Villages are and where some of these voters are coming into Florida. They're basically the Midwest that has been snowbirded, I guess if that's a term, into Florida. So don't think of Florida for the president as the Miami when people think about Florida. Think of it as really much more of a Midwestern battleground state in the middle of a state that it also happens to have palm trees and is on the ocean.
So just quickly, Tam, 1 or 2 reporters showing up for this tomorrow?
Yes, this is the thing. The president is doing a grand relaunch of his campaign. And, Joe Biden had 2 bites of the apple with his launch. The video and the rally, Kamala Harris, all of them have gotten attention at least twice on the Democratic side. And so President Trump is looking for a little bit of that attention as well.
So, Amy, let's go back to what we were talking about, or at least what Yamiche was reporting on, and that is the Democrats. They're campaigning all over the place, but a number of them were in South Carolina over the weekend. And there's a new poll out in South Carolina, which has some pretty interesting numbers. We're going to show all of you. We try not to overemphasize polls, but this one is kind of striking. Joe Biden, yes, he's still in the lead at 37%, but he's dropped 9 points since the last poll. The other dramatic change, Elizabeth Warren up 9 points. She's at 17, still far back. But looking at these numbers and these candidates, what do you see, Amy?
Well, what we see is a continuation of a trend we've seen for the last week or so in national polls and other state polls, which is Elizabeth Warren and to a certain extent Pete Buttigieg rising and Bernie Sanders starting to see a little bit of a slide. And even Biden starting to see a little bit of a slide. There was a national poll out by NBC, Wall Street Journal over the weekend showing that the enthusiasm for Biden has slipped a little bit since an earlier poll this spring, while enthusiasm for Elizabeth Warren has gone up. So I think we had been hearing from folks on the trail that, boy, Elizabeth Warren is getting a lot of second looks. I'm hearing from a lot of people in these early states saying they want to hear more from Elizabeth Warren. So that sort of the discussion that people were having on the ground is starting to show up in the polls. It's not huge movement, but it's that Joe Biden remains the front runner. But when we're now seeing about where that next tier of candidates, who's shaping up to to now challenge Biden, who's shaping up to be the leader in the left of center debate for the Democratic Party. I think Elizabeth Warren now has really made a significant move.
Interesting. And Tam, I know you're following these candidates as much as you can. At the same time, you're following the president, who belongs to the other political party. But South Carolina is a different, it's obviously its own state, but it's going to say something different when South Carolina voters vote.
Yeah, I think that is what all of these candidates are looking to do. Not only do they want to win the South Carolina, but they want to be able to say, look, I won South Carolina. South Carolina represents a more diverse version of the electorate, more closely reflects the Democratic voters nationwide that will be voting in November. And they are looking to be able to show that they can garner excitement among African-American voters who will be critical in states like Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Meanwhile, Amy, we did, at the end of last week, learn which candidates are going to be debating on which nights. 20 of the 23 were chosen, made the cut. And we're going to show everybody again what that lineup looks like on Wednesday night, June the 26th. These 10 candidates, Elizabeth Warren being certainly one of the more prominent names, but they all have a shot. The next night, it's these 10. Do we see something about this lineup that tells us
anything about what to expect? I know. Well, I mean, for night 2, as you can see, Joe Biden is sitting in night 2 along with the other top-tier candidates, all of them except for Elizabeth Warren, who is in that first night. And I think we're all watching to see how Joe Biden will do. He is the front runner in large part because people see him as the most electable and the safest choice in this. The way that lead of his slips is if he suddenly does not look as stable, or if he has a moment where he looks not quite as rugged and able to continue in this front-runner path. For Elizabeth Warren, the question is it a better thing to be in the first debate where you're not going to have a whole bunch of people firing on you, where you don't have to mix it up with the other top tier. You get this whole night to yourself. I don't know. But I think for political reporters, what they want to see is to see if there will be any movement in a race that's been incredibly stable. And that is going to be tough to do when you have so many people on stage all trying to get their quick little bite in that's going to get picked up by national news.
All right, we don't have time to have you say this, but Tam, you told us today it's going to be like speed dating. We'll see see if that bears itself out. Tam Keith in Orlando, waiting for the president's rally tomorrow. Amy Walter here in Washington. Thank you both.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Pedestrian deaths are the highest they have been since 1990. Nearly 50,000 people have died on U.S. roads since 2009, according to federal statistics. The reasons vary. Some blame cell phones and distracted driving. Others say sprawling cities and wide roads are the bigger culprits. A team of student reporters from the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at Arizona State University has been investigating what victims, families, and advocates say are slow changes to a deadly problem. Here is Aaron Kimball-Sannett with that report.
Above a busy intersection in Los Angeles, a sign cautions motorists to drive with care. It's yards away from where 17-year-old Christian Vega was struck and killed in February. Vega was killed here on Riverside Drive. Residents have complained that navigation apps have introduced new motorists to this stretch of road that can't safely handle the added traffic.
Riverside Drive, it's become a fifth lane of the 5 freeway.
David De La Torre and other concerned residents have called for safety improvements along the street for years. City engineers approved a left turn signal for the intersection in 2017. But it wasn't installed until after Christian's death because the city says funding was unavailable. Across the country, pedestrian deaths are on the rise, jumping from more than 4,000 in 2009 to nearly 6,000 in 2017.
Streets are wider. Streets are so wide that streets are basically freeways sometimes, or they have freeway-like speeds.
Daisy Villafuerte with the advocacy group Los Angeles Walks says the city wasn't designed for walking, which leaves pedestrians vulnerable.
if you try to walk a street, you'll spend a good 10 minutes without ever seeing a crosswalk.
Unlike older, denser East Coast cities that were built before automobiles ruled the roads, Sunbelt cities like Phoenix and LA were built with cars as the dominant mode of transportation.
We're seeing an epidemic of pedestrian crashes happening on arterials.
Engineer Randy Dittburner says that pedestrians and vehicles use the same major roadways, which creates conflict.
But that's where the pedestrians want to be, just like that's where everybody wants to be. That's the way to get through our cities and towns.
A good example? Southern Avenue in Phoenix. It's where 15-year-old Keyshawn Eubanks was killed by a car in December. Eubanks was crossing the street when his family says a driver sped out of her lane and hit him. His mother, Nida Richards, found him on the curb.
Once I, took his hood off his head, I just knew he was gone.
The Eubanks apartment complex is half a mile away from the signaled crosswalks on Central and 7th Avenues. That's a long way to walk for people who need to catch a bus to school or work.
That makes no sense. Kids are going to be kids. I can't sit up and tell you I walked to Central just to go to the dollar store.
National advocacy groups say deaths like Keyshawn's are more common in low-income areas. It's evident in Southern California, where residents in underserved neighborhoods are waiting for safer streets.
Early infrastructure that a lot of other parts of the city take for granted just never got to this part of the area.
District 6 council member Nuri Martinez knows this intersection lacks some crucial road safety elements, things like sidewalk accessibility ramps.
For a mom who's trying to get to work every morning and drop off her kid with a stroller, how is that mom supposed to be able to cut across the street and use that sidewalk or that side of the sidewalk when there is not an accessible way for her to do so?
These ramps are now being built as a part of Vision Zero. It's an initiative that many cities across the country and world have adopted. The goal for Los Angeles is to have 0 traffic fatalities or serious injuries by the year 2025.
But that's the infrastructure needs that I think that we've been waiting for a really long time. We're finally starting to get to make sure that these communities of color in particular, that those needs are starting to get addressed.
Families who have lost loved ones are often the people pushing for change.
I think we need to get more people like me, a family who's been affected or a survivor, to actually go to one of their meetings and talk to the residents themselves.
Debbie Shung and Philip Tam started the organization Southern California Families for Safe Streets. They did so after their oldest son, 7-year-old Aiden Tam, was killed while crossing the street.
And all of a sudden, I saw a driver make a right turn into the crosswalk. Aiden got hit. We ran over. The truck was on top of Aiden.
The couple wants safer roads and safer drivers. They know changing laws and minds is a challenge, but it's not impossible. The European Union has seen a 36% decline in pedestrian deaths between 2007 and 2016. Experts say it's because, unlike the US, the EU has found ways to redesign vehicles and roads to reduce pedestrian deaths.
It should not necessitate a death. It should not necessitate a lawsuit for action to occur.
At the end of the day, community leaders and advocates like De La Torre say they want government agencies to take a more proactive approach to roadway design and pedestrian safety. And while they keep working to make streets safer for pedestrians, the families of Keyshawn, Aiden, and Christian keep working through their grief. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Aaron Kimball-Sannett with the Cronkite School of Journalism in Phoenix.
And again, that story came to us from the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism at Arizona State. It's an initiative of the Scripps Howard Foundation. A New York play explores what happens to a family after the father is arrested for downloading and trading child pornography on the internet. Hari Srinivasan sat down with the actress' wife who has written an emotional drama about the searing experience. It's part of Canvas, our ongoing coverage of arts and culture.
I see these decent human beings who have done some unspeakable things.
In this play, you start out with a line that I want to read out. It says, "This isn't one of those shows where I'm here to tell you that I was okay and then I wasn't okay, but now I am okay." Where are you 4 years out?
You know, I hate the word journey, but I guess I'm on the journey. And I have days where they're both amazing and excruciatingly difficult.
Difficult and complicated. Maddie Corman is a working actress, seen in several television series and movies.
Hi guys, did you come by to see my brother?
Including Some Kind of Wonderful and Made in Manhattan. Alexander, also an actor, but more recently a frequent director of Law & Order.
A Dobbs Ferry actor and TV director has pleaded guilty to child pornography charges today.
In 2015, Alexander was arrested at home for having child pornography on his computer. He was not charged with any physical or sexual abuse of any children, including his own. Alexander pled guilty, was sentenced to 10 years probation, and forced to register as a sex offender.
Probably one of the first questions that people are going to have when they watch this or hear about it is, why are you still with him? Why is he helping raise your children?
Yeah. You know, and I understand that question. It's not a fun question. It's not something I ever thought that I would have to defend or explain. It's one of the reasons I think that I can't explain it in a 2-minute soundbite. I can barely do it in my 90-minute show.
Accidentally Brave, a one-act, one-woman show, is running off-Broadway in New York City. Maddie recounts learning and eventually reckoning with her husband's use of child pornography.
And I start to feel something that I can't quite put into words, but it is compassion, which I can't feel for my own partner, at least not yet.
Through it all, despite her anger, upset, and shame, Corman decided to stay with Alexander, moving from the suburbs into New York City and starting over, something her family could afford.
I am incredibly aware of the privilege, and I'm also very aware that there are other victims in this crime, not just my kids and my family and me, that there are people who are very badly hurt by child pornography.
In the play, Corman tries to answer that basic question. Why is she still with her husband? A decision that took her many months to reach.
This is a person that I love, that I had been with for 20 years, who has what I think is an illness that he is dealing with and making amends for, and he's a good person who did a bad thing. I mean, that's the simple way to say it.
When this initially happened, were you concerned for the safety of your children and balancing that with this person that you loved?
I was not concerned for the safety of my children around him. I never thought that he would hurt my children. This is a big thing to have happen in your life and then to have it be public, which it was. But whether I stayed married to my husband or not, this is their father. So they were going to have to deal with this in some way or another.
The family had no choice but to deal with the fallout from the arrest, but the play was a choice, one Maddie made intentionally in the hope, she says, of helping others as a friend helped her.
Instead of all the people saying, I feel so sorry for you, she said, I feel sorry with you. And at one point I said, how can I ever pay you back? And she said, you'll just do it for someone else. And I tell him, I will never, ever be okay with the things that you chose to look at. What I do is tell stories. So this just seemed like an actual way to do service, to share something that I've been through that maybe will help someone else who feels so alone, because it's a very, very lonely feeling when your life suddenly takes a turn and it's not what it was supposed to look like.
Anything that helps people discuss uncomfortable topics, I think, should be embraced.
Couples therapist Keith Miller believes there is value in Corman's efforts.
The people behind abuse or violence are not monsters, they're humans. And I think it does us a disservice when we make up a story or a mythology and say those people should be put away and never thought about, because what it does is it puts us further away from prevention and education and all the contact points that are really necessary for engagement with a complex thing like trauma.
I'm me. I shared everything with you. How could you not trust me with that?
You have teenagers now, and you have one in college. Mm-hmm. This is a lot for a teenage mind, or even a college mind, to process.
Yeah.
How are the kids?
In the play, I say this, and I say this in my life, I can answer that, but really you should ask them. I mean, that's their story to tell. The fear of re-traumatizing my kids or just bringing something back up that's calmed down is living in fear, not living in truth, because this happened. This is not going to go away if we don't talk about it for a few months. This is not going to go off the internet if I don't do this play. The story was already in the paper. I mean, I think some people say I'm brave to tell this story.
And for now, Maddie Corman is trying to stay brave, accidentally or not. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Hari Srinivasan in New York City.
To human frailty.
50 years ago this month, violent demonstrations by the gay community against a police raid at the Stonewall Inn in New York's Greenwich Village led to the modern gay rights movement. Tonight, as part of NewsHour's coverage of the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, over the next several days, we're sharing a report from StoryCorps. That's a conversation between John Banvard and Jerry Nadeau, both military veterans who served in World War II and Vietnam, respectively. At the time, John, 100, and Jerry, 72, sat down in the veterans' home where they live to reflect on their 25 years together. StoryCorps records meaningful conversations across the country that are preserved in an archive at the Library of Congress. This is an animation of their conversation.
Hello, my name is Jerry Nadeau. I'm with John Banvard.
And I was born in Brooklyn, New York.
No. You got to say your name and everything. Hello, my name is...
Hello, my name is John Banvard. I am 100 years of age.
When I first met you, John, you were 75 years old. What would it have been like if you didn't meet me?
I would have continued being lonely. I'd been absolutely lost.
When we met, we were sort of in the closet.
Yeah.
And I never had a real relationship. Now we've been together almost 25 years. And when we moved into the veterans home, we moved in together. And a lot of people were wondering, I wonder what their relationship is.
Yes.
Well, when we got married, they knew what our relationship was.
I was expecting we'd be ridiculed, and there was very little of that.
We got married at the veterans home, and we said, if you came to see the bride, you're out of luck. Do you remember that?
Yes, of course.
It was very informal.
It was done simply, yes.
We served hot dogs.
Which is hardly wedding food.
Remember, John, I was with you in a cafeteria, and somebody came up, and they were with their family, and they said, oh, this is Gerard Nadeau, and this is his husband, John. I never heard that before.
Yeah, that was very nice.
You've made my life complete.
I could say the same thing to you. I think we're probably as happy together as any two people you're likely to meet.
This story is part of StoryCorps' Stonewall Out Loud collection in honor of the anniversary of the Stonewall Uprising in June 1969. StoryCorps is working to preserve the personal histories of members of the LGBTQ community. You can find more animations and information on how to record your own conversation on our website, pbs.org/newshour. And a late development, the Pentagon has announced that the U.S. will send about 1,000 additional troops to the Middle East in response to, quote, hostile behavior from Iran. A U.S. military official says they will conduct intelligence and surveillance and provide force protection. Washington blames Tehran for attacks on 2 oil tankers last week. The move follows last month's announcement to send an additional 1,500 troops, bolstering the more than 60,000 already deployed to the region. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you, and we'll see you soon.
You're watching PBS.